Hello everyone, this is Lucian Vulsal with the Freedom Alternative. We are in Sevnica, Slovenia, where that would be Melania Trump's birthplace. Flotus, if you're watching this, the right-wing cabal in Slovenia that invited me over here says hi. We're obviously saying hi. And okay, enough with the talk. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Today we're going to talk about Slovenia, specifically about the politics and geopolitics of Slovenia while you're looking at footage from this country, starting from the home village of the current First Lady of the United States. Slovenia will host the next year's 3 Seas Initiative Summit, and it is perhaps a good moment to get to know the country a little bit. Of course, my hope is that I will be there at the summit and report about it, just like I did this year. For a country of 2 million people, Slovenia punches above its weight in many areas, and its location on the map certainly does help a lot with that. In addition to being the country of origin of Melania Trump, the country bordering the Adriatic Sea, Italy, Hungary, Croatia and Austria is the country with the smallest Gini coefficient in Europe, meaning that it has the highest level of income equality. Most of this is possible because smart people keep their money away from the onerous taxation system, but don't tell that to the communists who run the country. They'll accuse you of hate speech or of being too mean. Having been passed around from one to another by greater powers in Europe, but especially by Germany and Austria, Slovenia is what one would call a young country. Although the first attempts at statehood date back to 1918, the geopolitical entity you're looking at right now is only 27 years old, while the rest of the country's history is tied to various larger entities, most recently in the past the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia, and currently the continuation of Germany by other means, otherwise known as the European Union. While technically part of the Intermarium area and the 3 Seas Initiative, Slovenia is a complete and utter outlier, a status that is not foreign at all to Slovenes. Back in the days of Yugoslavia, Slovenia was also an outlier in many respects, including in the economic sphere, the Socialist Republic of Slovenia having at one point a domestic product that was 2.5 times the average of the rest of Yugoslav republics. Linguistically, the place is different too. Outside of Macedonia, the other ex-Yugoslav republics broadly speak the same language, although it is fashionable to claim that Serbian, Croatian and Bosnian are different languages. But Slovene is also quite different, largely because the place has consistently been at the crossroads between Germanic languages, Romance languages and of course the Slavic languages. Add to that a bit of non-European linguistic influence from Hungary, and that's how you get modern Slovene. In order to properly discuss the modern geopolitics of Slovenia, a bit of history is necessary just so we can have things in a context, because otherwise some realities may make no sense. One example would be the fact that right-wingers, even those woke on the issue of the religion of peace or on the issue of the LGBTist religion, are also very, very pro-EU in this country. To understand why this is the case, a bit of historical context is needed. The story of the 1970s and 1980s in general in the Intermarium goes like this. More and more people were disillusioned with communism. Both the elites and the common plebs joined hands and organized resistance movements that eventually, around the year 1989, led to the collapse of the Marxist-Leninist regimes. As a result of the collapse, the post-communist powers agreed to implement a capitalist, or at the very least a non-socialist economic system, and also liberalize the social and cultural sphere. Well, in Slovenia, it did not quite work out exactly that way. For all intents and purposes, opposition to Titoist socialism was essentially non-existent throughout most of the Yugoslav period, outside some tiny and frankly politically irrelevant literary circles. In fact, the main ideologue of the so-called Titoist path to socialism was Edvard Kardelj, a Slovene Marxist theoretician who, until his death, fulfilled many important political roles in the wider Yugoslav state, including Deputy Prime Minister, Member of the Presidency, President of the Federal Assembly of Yugoslavia, and Minister of Foreign Affairs. From these roles, Kardelj influenced the Yugoslav politics in ways that, for better or worse, pleased most Slovenes for most of the time. Kardelj is one of the main ideological architects of something that came out to be known in Cold War history as the non-aligned movement, founded by Yugoslavia through Josip Broz Tito's signature, an organization which, by the way, still exists today. Except today it's anything but non-aligned, since it's headed by Venezuela and almost all of its members are countries ruled by brutal communist regimes or other forms of dictatorships. But back in the 1950s, the non-aligned movement was about geopolitics, and it all started with a Slovenian ideologue. Long story short, communism in Slovenia was far less severe than in the rest of the Intermarium, and it can seriously be argued that it was an entirely different regime than what the rest of the Intermarium experienced. To give you an example, Slovenes could cross into both Italy and Austria much more easily than, say, Hungarians, for instance, who essentially could not cross at all. It was through Slovenia that most of the Western contraband merchandise became then available to most of the Intermarium. Back home in Romania, everything semi-decent that the commies had banned was available in what we would call Serbian markets, which were oftentimes operated by ethnic Serbs, hence the name, but were dealing with products brought behind the Iron Curtain, mostly by Slovenes. So under these circumstances, the fall of communism in Slovenia happened rather differently than in the rest of the Intermarium, and indeed in many ways differently than even the rest of Yugoslavia. The wave of discontent stepped out from irrelevance after the death of Josip Broz Tito, and it focused on the argument that Belgrade was exploiting the Slovenes economically in order to hold a bloated, remote, expensive and inefficient federal administration. And that's about it. Not much about free speech, not much about the socialist economic model, and not much about geopolitics. While in Poland, for instance, the Solidarity movement did argue that both the economic and the civilizational model are incompatible with the Polish society, while in Hungary the dissidents were distributing books by Milton Friedman, and while in Romania dissidents were engaging in Antifa style of tactics against the communist regime, in Slovenia it was just that Belgrade was not being too nice. The way a Slovenian source explained it to me, quote, "Most people were pretty happy with Titoist socialism. It was the Belgrade part that bothered them. So we wanted socialism without Belgrade because we thought we could do it better. Capitalism was not part of the deal when the old regime fell." Close quote. While at first I was a bit incredulous about that description, the more I dug into the economic data of the country, the more on point that description became. Slovenia is today one of the 2 countries in Europe where state-owned drugstores or pharmacies are still a thing. The other one being, of course, Sweden, a country which up until 2009 held a North Korea-style ban on privately owned drugstores. Slovenia is also the only country in Europe where state-owned supermarkets are still around, even though that is finally changing now. Even Belarus abolished that, but not Slovenia. Not yet anyway. While all countries have a state bank with which the state pays out various things such as contractors, welfare and state debt, Slovenia is one of the few countries where the state owns a commercial bank in ways that are hardly comparable to anyone else in Europe. The state-owned NLB Group has commercial banking subsidiaries all over the former Yugoslavia, and much to exactly nobody's surprise, it operates in a sloppy manner, and again, much to exactly nobody's surprise, it has routinely been used by corrupt politicians for their own interests and oftentimes against the geopolitical interests of the country. Most notably in this department would be NLB's involvement in laundering money for the terrorist regime in the Islamic Republic of Iran. As of November of this year, the Nova Ljubljanska Banka is now a public company, opening up for non-state investors for the first time. It should be noted that the NLB is not inherited from the communist era, but rather founded in 1994 as a result of the wisdom of the post-communist elites, confirming once again that capitalism really was not part of the deal in this country. NLB is not the only state-owned bank. Abanka is another one which in the last 10 years swallowed millions upon millions of euros in taxpayers' money in an attempt to stay afloat. If we are to believe the cathedral media, both will be sold in 2019. If we are to believe my sources in the country, NLB is here to stay for a bit longer. The NLB swallowed as much as 3 billion euros in bailouts over the last 10 years, and its market cap is still under 1 billion. Yet despite all that, most political figures in the country believe the Slovenian public should be milked even more to keep the NLB around because more national interest. So it is thus in this context of local socialism every step of the way that we should look at Slovenia's geopolitics. The fact of the matter is that most political establishmentarians and a significant chunk of the populace has an inherent socialist bias, and, if I am allowed to borrow from the leftist lingo, they should first raise their ideological level. What I mean by that is that this place is great for trying out new messages. Most people have never heard in their lifetimes a non-leftist case being made on economics or on geopolitics, but more on that later. Slovenia came up again in the international media earlier this year when various outlets, both in the cathedral and in the alternative media, proclaimed the new victory of the quote-unquote far-right or of populists, citing the results gotten by Slovenska Demokratska Stranka, or the SDS, which topped the polls, getting almost 25% of the vote, which meant 25 seats in the 90-member parliament. Not enough for an outright majority, but with the first shot at forming the government, at least in theory. SDS were described in most right-wing and independent media as a party that is friendly to the concerns that normal people have: immigration, regulation, political correctness, and so on. Sadly, that's not exactly true. For starters, SDS did not get to form the government in the end. The country is ruled by Marian Sharets from the list of Marian Sharets, a sort of political party headed by the former actor that can best be described as leftist populism. Basically, the other parties did to SDS what it has been happening consistently to Sverigedemokraterna in Sweden. Given what I've explained earlier, this shouldn't be a surprise, as Slovenia as a country is basically the Sweden of the Intermarium. But in addition to that, SDS itself is more or less like Sverigedemokraterna, namely a center-left party that pays some lip service to anti-mass immigration issues, and that's pretty much it. To give you an idea, the MEPs from SDS voted for the migrant quotas in the European Parliament, all while their colleagues back home were campaigning against them. The silver lining to this is that the country is accustomed to unstable coalitions. The 2018 elections were snap elections, the third snap elections in a row to be more precise. But until the next snap elections, it should be noted that the only thing the ruling coalition really agrees on is on cultural issues. And by that, I mean cultural leftist issues. Unlike the rest of the ex-Yugoslav space and the Intermarium in general, the cultural left is very strong in Slovenia. And the cultural left has its main power, just like in other countries, in the university. For instance, recently the Social Sciences faculty and the Philosophy faculty at the University of Ljubljana have announced that they will cease the usage of neutral grammatical gender in their documents and instead use the female grammatical gender, because that's what the cultural university left understands by equality and fairness. And this is where, thankfully, non-leftists in the country have started to learn and make some progress. Up until a few years ago, right-wingers were only concerned with winning the next election and showing the facts about the disasters of left-wing governance. That is far from a winning strategy, since most people don't vote on facts anyway, and the left doesn't compete on facts, but on feel-good mythology. Subverting the cultural left in Slovenia is going to take a while, but the first step, that of understanding why and how it needs to be done, is starting to happen. But of course, there is a lot of work. Even though Slovenia is a member of both NATO and the Three Seas Initiative, the geopolitics of the country and of the people are really quite upside down. The standard geopolitical stance on the Slovenian mainstream scene was, and continues to be, wherever Germany goes, we're going with it, even inside the SDS, vilified by the cathedral as far-right and populist and Eurosceptic, but whose MEPs supported the Juncker and Angela Merkel agenda almost always. When it comes to the transatlantic link, Slovenia might indeed be the weakest in the whole Three Seas Initiative, with most of the populace holding an inherent and noticeable anti-USA bias. That is in addition to a smaller but still noticeable share of the populace that holds an outright pro-Russia sentiment, something which is nowhere near as prevalent anywhere else in the Three Seas Initiative. The pro-German bias of the political establishment also nurtures, by proxy, a pro-Russian bias simply by virtue of the fact that German interests are inherently tied to the Russian ones, including and especially at the expense of the Intermarium area. All of this is in addition to the both old and new Slovenian left, which have been nurturing anti-US sentiments since forever. In this context, Slovenia hosting the Three Seas Initiative Summit is quite an interesting development. The summit is organized by the Office of the Presidency. Borut Pahor, the president of the republic and a former communist and long-time leftist, insisted on hosting the summit in 2019. As an accredited journalist at the 2018 summit, I have learned that Ljubljana wasn't the first option, but Mr. Pahor's insistence convinced the other Three Seas Initiative leaders to agree. This can mean two things. The way Mr. Pahor has been described to me by my sources, the current president commands quite a bit of respect even from ideological foes, largely because he has been willing in the past to go against his base if the historical or geopolitical circumstances required it. So either Mr. Pahor senses that the geopolitics of Slovenia would be better served if the country is not exclusively tethered to Germany, or Mr. Pahor wishes or hopes to be an agent of co-option of the Three Seas Initiative and turning it into yet another EU institution that is completely neutralized. I don't know the answer, but it's something which political analysts, pundits and other interested parties in the Intermarium area should keep in mind throughout 2019. So with all of this in mind, we can now explain a bit better why most right-wingers in Slovenia are far more pro-EU than other areas of the Intermarium. It all boils down to economics, really. Almost all of the capitalist policies implemented in Slovenia happened at the behest of or following pressure from the European Union. If it were all up to elected Slovene officials, the country would have been even more socialistic than it already is. And this is a fact that determines many right-wingers to be slightly less Eurosceptic than their counterparts are in other countries. This fact that the Slovenian political establishment is further to the left of the EU establishment is noticeable these days too. The current cabinet may as well be Justin Trudeau's cabinet, promising and attempting to deliver so many handouts that one would wonder what is wrong with the government. Leftism is what's wrong, but without the European Union, which allows entrepreneurs to move their capital away from the far-reaching hands of the politicians, the situation would have been a lot worse. This is a situation comparable with Spain, where libertarians tend to be slightly more for the EU simply because the Eurozone straitjacket limits some of the far-left instincts of the politicians to spend like crazy. So again, for a country of 2 million people, the politics of this place is really complicated. A lot more complicated than most of the Intermarium and really most of Europe. One thing is certain though, Slovenia punches above its weight in politics. Let us not forget that the most popular far leftist thinker at this moment is also a Slovene, Slavoj Žižek, whose work has done more to influence the wider Western culture towards leftism than many give him credit for. In the last 100 of years, Slovenia gave rise to 2 dangerous leftist ideologues and 1 First Lady of the United States. There are wealthier and bigger countries out there whose contribution to world politics are a lot smaller in the same period of time. What I'm saying is that one should not underestimate Slovenia just because it's tiny and in a corner of the map. The place is much more than the shortest road between Hungary and Italy. And Three Seas Initiative influencers would better keep that in mind going forward. There are signs that things are changing. Although divided on many issues, the Slovenians are noticing that the direction of the EU today is quite different from the direction many believed it to be 15 years ago. This could, in the near future, lead to shifts in attitudes and eventually in voting patterns. The question is whether there is patience and space for this to occur, and whether it can occur in sufficient amounts in a reasonable time frame. I do not know the final answer to either of these questions, but I believe that it is definitely worth trying, and that by trying we will also find out the answer. And this concludes the 3 Seas initiative reporting for this year. The topic will come back to attention as we get closer to the 2019 3 Seas initiative. At the moment of this recording, the exact date of the summit remains unknown, but if I were to guesstimate, it will be in late August, early September. I just hope it won't be in early August, because I have an important trip scheduled then. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the footage taken earlier this year in my trip to Slovenia. Thank you all for your consistent and generous support. Please do consider a donation if you derive any value from the work being done here. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.